Hi guys, hope you're alright. So, I wanted to talk today a little bit about feeling lost, really. I know that's a very vague, kind of emotive thing to say, but what I mean is like inherent sort of lack of purpose and just feeling like you don't fit in anywhere and you've no clue like what you're meant to be doing really with, this infliction of consciousness, to be honest. And I kind of see I think a lot of people because obviously we compare ourselves to other people, right? I see a lot of people, even like neurotypicals and stuff, who they struggle with it, but it a lot of people don't admit it, and I think maybe one of the things that makes me kind of stand out from other people is I'm more open about the fact that I see the absurd. I think when you look at lots of other people, especially neurotypical people, they all have things that anchor them, and especially historically this is true, right? So you'd have people nowadays, right, most people don't have a fixed career, if one at all, because of how messed up the employment market is, especially in the UK. And so it used to kind of be Bob's a builder, and Charlie's a fucking blacksmith or whatever, and he's a teacher, and he's a he's a politician, he's an engineer, whatever, you'd have all these things, right? And that would just be people's identity, and then they would they'd have a solid group of friends, and some people still do, and they have they'll have an identity, a place in society. They'll probably have a marriage, and that won't only be part of their identity, but that will quite literally anchor them there, because they're married, and stuff, and they're all they're locked in. I don't necessarily mean they're trapped. I know lots of people are happily married, of course, but it's it would be very difficult for them to change. So there's not much reason for them to question their place in society. A lot of the time, a lot of people nowadays I see are struggling with that, and I'm of course struggling with that. I don't have a fixed identity. I do. There are some things, I do, I have certain hobbies, and I do have part-time, employment, but, it's kind of hard to find the words really for it, but, I just, I don't feel like I have, a fundamental purpose, really. I'm just, I've said before, about people, we are just, animals with a bigger brain than the rest of them, right? And that's basically it. And I think, a lot of people, they get distracted by, culture and stuff, so, I think, 90% of, people my parents' age, they just, they just think about, celebrities, or, what's going to be on the TV, which football team's winning, and that's, enough for them, and they don't resort to deep conversations. But I think when you're someone like me, and let's make no mistake about it, being autistic and having complex PTSD that comes with that, self-diagnosed, but it's very obvious to anyone who spends a bit of time around me, because I have anxiety and depression and comorbidities because of that. So when you kind of take that into account, and I have always been kind of sidelined, I've never really had a place where I fit in, so that kind of gives me that gives me more time to think deeply about this stuff, and sorry, getting over a cold, but I also see in other people a lot of the time their identity is quite thinly veiled. If you if some guy, for example, right, I mean, you're seeing it now, right? People who've had jobs for like 20 years, you know, and then AI replaces them, and then like, you know, suddenly that's a huge part of their identity gone. And then maybe, you know, their relationship breaks down and they lose their house or something because because they've lost that other status and stuff, you know. And then it's like, you really, and then, yeah, a lot of the time people will still try and cope through that and be like, you know, oh, it's okay, and it's going to be all right, you know. But a lot of the time, I think when people do that, they're just doing that to save face, really, to try and almost mitigate the damage that comes with that. And yeah, this is kind of like, goes back to what I was saying, like, people were much more secure in their identity, in their place in society in previous generations. Yeah, because I think, like, but because I acknowledge this and because I think about this, I think other people, you know, when I talk to, like, people in my life, you know, about deep stuff like this, they don't like it. And I guess the thing that prompted me to make this is kind of like I said in my previous video, people are starting to pile on a lot of pressure to me, and just people my age in general, because as you know by now, I'm closer to 30 than I am 20, which is a horrible thought. But like, by this age, right, like, most people, at least historically, had kind of achieved adulthood, you know. They were possibly married, they were almost certainly, at least in Western cultures, living independently. They definitely had a solid career path, a career identity. Yeah, even if it was like a low-paid, relatively low-status job, you know, it was still there, and it was still a solid thing they had, you know. And yeah, they wouldn't be the highest status in society, but they would still have a place, you know. And I think a lot of the time I am a bit of an inconvenient truth, reminding people that there are lots of people like me, an increasing number of people like me, especially neurodivergent, but also neurotypicals as well, who I'm seeing that are struggling. And we are losing identity. And I think that's related to a lot of problems happening in the UK, right? You've got, just the world in general, but particularly the West, and even more particularly the UK. Like, yeah, I've talked before about, like, you know, autistic people's employment rates in the UK. Official statistics say that it's like 29% have any form of employment at all, and, you know, only like 15% have a full-time job. And that was from a few years ago. I think that's 2020, 2021. And like the year, it was kind of the year before that, so before the big thing that happened. But now, like, you're seeing, especially with, like, you know, current events and making it even worse, you know, like, you're seeing, like, across the board, so, like, basically, like, because neurotypicals are, like, still an overwhelming majority of the population, like, you're seeing, like, youth unemployment. I've seen the latest figure coming out puts it at between 16 and 20%. And in the UK, that doesn't just mean, like, yeah, that wouldn't even, like, count, like, NEETs and stuff. That counts people who are, like, signed on to unemployment. Like, they're officially there, you know, they're like, actively looking for work. And, you know, sometimes I'll, like, eavesdrop on conversations in public. Like, there's one the other day, and this guy said, like, oh, like, I applied to this job, you know, and they said, oh, they'd had 380 applications. And he just said it so casually, because it's like, he probably felt like, oh, that's all right, because the other one had, like, 3,080 applications, you know? So, like, maybe I am kind of making excuses for myself here, because I'm not, like, a fully functional, like, you know, like, person. And I'm not, you know? And a lot of that is because of my personal flaws, which I attribute to autism and, you know, CPTSD, traits that come along with that, unfortunately. But people need to acknowledge that like, it's not, if I was born 50 years ago, then I should be held to higher standards, because like, not only like, having like, as they call it, quite high functioning autism, even though it's kind of an oxymoron, like, that wasn't as crippling of an issue. And there was that in some cases, there was positive discrimination for people, in favor of people in my demographic, right? Like, we're more encouraged to, like, have careers and stuff like that. Well, I say we, it wasn't me, it was people who looked like me, but nowadays it's the complete opposite. I've told you before, like, I've been rejected from job applications in the past because I didn't fit diversity criteria, and I'm just one of many sad stories like that. And yeah, it just feels like it's not just like the economic and like status demands, but just social demands in general. Like, there's increasing social demands, especially when you get to my age. Like, as I say, like, I'm only a few years off a big 30 whatever, and I'm not going to find anything witty to say like that, but it's sad, it just is what it is. Like, I'm only a few years off of that, right? And yeah, people are really kind of starting to like say, what's your life plan? And I was like, even someone who's kind of like asked me this before, they said the other day, like, oh, I don't know, like, because they have a job or whatever, and they said, I don't know if the robot's going to like kick me out of my job in like the next 6 months or a year. It's going to be at some point. But and they said, like, I should like pretend I have a plan. I should tell someone, like, oh, I'm going to do this, oh yeah, I'm just going to like think more positively, and then like, oh, my bank account's going to multiply by 10 and I'm going to be able to like buy a deposit on some tiny house. And yeah, that's just from thinking positive. Like, it's like I've written about this before, and something else that people say, have said to me, is that, and this is a valid point, but it's very difficult for me to kind of, like, feel like I can satisfactorily address it to myself. They've said that, like, because being like, again, like, high functioning-ish kind of autistic, like, I do have like fairly high verbal IQ and reasoning skills and stuff. And people sometimes say that I use that IQ kind of like almost against myself, almost like to make arguments against myself, to like reason, things like, and I kind of get what they mean, and it can be difficult to kind of, I think what it really boils down to is it can be very difficult for me to have discussions with people when they're incapable of understanding what I'm trying to explain. Like, a lot of you guys, being on the spectrum, and so, being on, being on the end of the bell curve, like, you can kind of understand what I'm saying, and you can appreciate what I'm saying, and a lot of you do, and sometimes you disagree, and that's fine, and I like it when people disagree with me, because it means I can improve. But a lot of the time I just get hit with straw man arguments, when, like, people in my family and stuff are kind of like, putting these expectations on me, and being like, oh, why didn't you just like go have a career like I did, and oh, why don't you just like, like, oh, I was given a house when I was like 18 years old, so why don't you just be like me? And you just hear all this stuff from people, and it doesn't apply to me, like people, like, this is the thing, like, most people in my family can't even relate to me. Like, I've talked before, obviously, about how difficult and how it's almost a death sentence, like, in terms of, like, just any kind of social thing, but, let alone relationships, for, to be, like, to be an autistic, especially in this day and age, and, like, people, like, I try and, like, people in my family have tried to give me advice over the years, about, like, oh, if I had like a toxic friendship in like primary school, it'd be like, oh, you should, like, don't be friends with that person anymore, just be friends with everyone else. And it's like, no, like, it's very difficult to make friends, it's like, if I don't hang out with these people who, don't respect me and stuff, then I won't have anyone to hang out with. And maybe that is kind of the best way, unfortunately, but having no social contact at all does have a huge detrimental effect on one's mental health, and then they'll admit that as well. And so it's kind of contradictory. It's like, why can't you just admit that, like, it's going to be like, life is very difficult for me and I'm going to need help, and you need to understand, but like, I'm not going to be able to achieve the same things as you in the same way, you know. It's just not. And yeah, and then of course, you know, the whole thing when it comes to like, yeah, like, you know, relationships and like kind of having social networks and stuff, you know, it's like people give you advice that worked for them doesn't work for you, you know. It's like that meme of like Henry Cavill, you know, where it's like, people ask me for dating advice, you know, I'll just ask her out, bro, you know, and it's like a picture of Henry Cavill. It's like, it works for me. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of exactly it, you know. It's like, you can almost make an analogy with like baby boomers being like, oh, just like work hard, bro, and give a firm handshake. Worked for me. And that's what you got to deal with. And if you kind of like object to that, or, you know, you rebuke it, then, you know, you get called lazy, you get called cynical, you get called entitled. It's like, no, I'm not being like unreasonable. I'm the one being reasonable. You're the one being unreasonable. Like, I can't, those opportunities are not there. And, you know, even if and like, that's not even taking the fact that like, I'm, you know, they're like, at least, you know, like effectively neurotypical, you know, maybe had some subclinical traits, and that's why I've got autism. But, you know, they never struggled with the same levels of social anxiety I did. And yeah, part of that is because of the day and age we're in. Part of it is just because, you know, I have a messed up brain because because of the way I was born, you know. Again, it's a bit of genetics, bit of epigenetics, bit of environment. Well, you know, I guess epigenetics is kind of environment, but you know what I mean, right? So, yeah, it's very frustrating, and because it's almost like, you know, I think it makes people think that, like, I don't want to, you know, improve. I don't want to, like, have a good life. I don't want to, like, you know, be like, you know, revered and feel like content and all the things, you know, that humans want to feel and be. Like, of course I do. But it's just not realistic a lot of the time, you know. Like, it just isn't. Like, I've tried, you know, I've applied to stuff. I've, you know, tried making loads of friends. You know, I've tried like I tried like sometimes like in the past, like, I've tried organizing like, you know, social events. I've tried like, you know, talking to people. You know, whenever I like do, you know, have the opportunity to work, I work hard and I try and do everything to a T, and I try and do it efficiently and effectively. And, you know, I try and apply, you know, my positive, or, you know, at least somewhat positive aspects of myself, like, you know, high IQ, you know, into having, you know, robust reasoning skills, and, you know, to to try and help other people, and, you know, help things go smoothly. But it's just not enough, you know. Like, the truth is, like, if I was like, let's say, you know, born, well, let's just for argument's sake, let's say if I was born like before 100 years ago, like I wouldn't have made it past birth, like, because I had birth defects, and I don't want to go into too much detail. I may have talked about it before. You know, they don't have like many long-term effects apart from maybe like, you know, being autistic, but you know, there wouldn't have been a technology for me to survive, and yeah, to be honest, you know, you can go back even further. Even if I had survived, you know, just by being autistic, like, I would have just been banished from the tribe, and I would have starved to death, or just been, you know, violently murdered by someone because I don't fit in. I mean, now that doesn't happen because legally people can't, but you know, or you know, people, like, there is an abundance of food relatively, and so no one really goes hungry and stuff like that, you know, and yeah, nowadays, like, yeah, people don't know what it's like to be me. That's the point. And I think they do. And I think it's so easy because things were easy for them. But yeah, no, it's like, And yeah, I guess the thing is, you know, like now it's like becoming really apparent that things are getting more difficult even for neurotypicals, you know. And I used to say, you know, like, oh, you know, it's like if you're neurotypical, you can kind of cope, and for the large part, you still can, you know, because you still have like the social, you know, you still have the traits that like get people to, you know, feel comfortable around you and accept you and stuff. But yeah, economically, it's still bad. Like, you know, you're probably still going to like have to have roommates and, you know, give half your salary to a boomer landlord and stuff. And, you know, then if you're lucky, you know, get an apartment with someone you get married to, and then, you know, like, it's worse than it was, but it's still better than being Spurg. That's kind of my point. But yeah, so everyone's struggling, and yeah, it just kind of feels like people are just perplexed, like, why I'm struggling to kind of get ahead. And it's like, well, you guys aren't either, you know? And of course, yeah, like I can list all other, you know, really good reasons, like being Spurg and stuff, why I'm not getting ahead as you know, as much as I'd like, as much as you'd like. But yeah, so I just wanted to vent about this. I hope you found it interesting. And yeah, really please, if there is really a flaw in my thinking, please do tell me, because I would love to like not feel this pressure, you know? And so, yeah, if there's something I could do to like, I don't know, like become like a spiritual boomer or whatever, like, yeah, please just let me know. Anyway, I'll stop babbling now. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.